The missing boy in Fitzrovia. My name's Harry, and I've been a private investigator in London for the last 14 years. Before that, I wore the blue. I was a Met officer, proud, or at least I was, until bureaucracy and bad leadership soured the job for me. When I finally turned in my badge in 2010, it wasn't because I hated the work. It was because I hated what it had become. So I did what many former coppers do. I went private. It was decent money. Better than what I got on the force, that's for sure. I spent the first couple of years chasing insurance fraud, doing background checks, and tracking assets for bitter divorcees. Some of it was rewarding. Most of it was soul-sucking. But every now and then, I'd get a case that reminded me why I loved being a detective in the first place. Finding missing people. That became my thing. Sometimes people went missing for dark reasons. Other times, they just slipped away from life and didn't want to be found. Either way, someone always wanted them back. That's how I met Connell and Moran Pennington. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when they called. Said they'd been referred to me by a former social worker I used to chat with at networking events. I recognized the name and agreed to meet in person, something I always insist on before taking a case. By 3 o'clock that day, I was sitting on a cozy sofa in their Hampstead home, sipping tea and eating a digestive biscuit while they told me about their missing grandson, Jaime. Connell and Moran were in their late 60s, all tweed and gentle smiles. Their home smelled of lavender and old books. They seemed kind, tired, but kind. Jaime had been their grandson since he was a boy, after his parents were killed in a hit-and-run. They'd raised him as their own, and even after he moved out a few months ago into his first flat in Fitzrovia, they remained close. Until Jaime vanished. It had been over a month since they'd last heard from him. No texts, no calls, no social media activity. He'd recently quit his job at a coffee shop, and they were worried sick. They said they considered going to the police but hesitated. There was something Jaime didn't know, something about the death of his parents. According to Connell, Jaime had recently asked for the full story. So, they told him. Told him that his parents were killed in a hit-and-run, that the driver had left them dying in the road, that if help had come sooner, they might have survived. Jaime didn't take it well. He seemed quieter after that, more distant. They worried he might have started using drugs, and the idea of calling the police felt like betrayal. What if they found him with something in his pocket? A charge like that could ruin his life. So instead, they came to me. I took the job, collected what they had, photos, his last known address, and the name of the coffee shop, and promised to start immediately. The coffee shop was small, tucked between a vintage bookshop and a yoga studio, a place with overpriced lattes and a chalkboard menu. When I asked about Jaime, a young barista with a nose ring said she knew him. In exchange for buying a muffin and coffee, she sat down with me at a back table and painted a very different picture than what Connell and Moran had described. Jaime wasn't some fragile boy grieving his parents. He was a regular partygoer, always out late, dabbling in drugs, and had a revolving door of relationships. According to her, he had quit the coffee shop 2 months prior, not because he vanished, but because he'd found another job. That job? Bartending at a secretive nightclub in Soho. One of those invite-only members clubs with no sign on the door and a password at the entrance. Place called the Pale Room, she said. You wouldn't even know it was there unless someone took you. That caught my attention. Clubs like that didn't just serve drinks. They served everything: access, power, danger. I thanked her and headed to Soho. The club didn't open until 9 p.m., so I killed time and returned later, paying the absurd 20 quid entrance fee to get past the door. Inside, it was dark and pulsing with music. Velvet booths, dim lights, people dressed like they were on the edge of fashion and crime. I flashed Jaime's photo to the staff. Most either didn't know him or pretended not to. Except one woman, a brunette supervisor behind the bar. She saw the photo, softened for half a second, then stiffened and said, "Never seen him before." Then she walked off. She was lying. I could see it in her face, the micro-expression, the flash of recognition she didn't suppress fast enough. Something was off. A few patrons admitted they knew Jaime, a charming, energetic bartender who was always up for a laugh. But they hadn't seen him in weeks. The manager, when I finally got to speak to him, was more forthcoming. Jaime had been acting strange, anxious. The night before he vanished, he came in, barely said hello, told a bartender he was waiting for someone, and then left. He said something cryptic. "I might not see you for a while." And that was it. Gone. Oh, and someone else had been asking about Jaime a few days prior. A man the staff didn't recognize, aggressive, pushing for answers. They'd thrown him out. Maybe a dealer, maybe worse. The manager gave me a tip. He said Jaime might be in Camden. He'd been staying with an older man there, a boyfriend, possibly a client. And with that, the pieces started clicking. Jaime wasn't just bartending. He'd been doing sex work. I spent 3 days in Camden, asking questions, showing photos, lurking in cafes. I didn't tell Connell and Morin the full truth. I didn't need to. I confirmed that Jaime had taken a dangerous turn, but I reassured them I was close. And I was. On the third afternoon, I spotted him. He walked into a coffee shop under the name Sean. Bleached hair, sunglasses, a different jacket, but it was him. I followed him from a distance as he walked down Pratt Street and entered a large 3-story home. An older man answered the door and kissed him before letting him in. Found him. I called Connell and Morin, told them the news, and asked if they wanted me to approach him or just keep an eye on the place. They asked me to monitor for 1 more day, then they'd decide. I agreed. More hours meant more pay, after all. That night I parked nearby. Nothing happened. No one left the house. Next morning, same thing. I waited. Around noon, I called Connell's phone. No answer, same with Morin. I waited an hour, then drove to their house. Only, it wasn't them who answered the door. A woman I'd never seen before claimed to be house-sitting. She said Connell and Morin had left for holiday that morning, booked months in advance. My stomach twisted. I knew something was wrong. I raced back to Camden. I walked to the house and rang the bell. No answer. But the door wasn't latched. It creaked open under my knock. Inside, it was silent. I called out. Nothing. I searched room by room until I reached the bedroom upstairs. I'll never forget what I saw. Jaime and the man, his boyfriend, lay dead on the bed, their bodies mutilated. The blood was everywhere. It hadn't been long, hours at most. I called the police and waited. I gave statements, told the story, twice, 3 times. And slowly the truth began to emerge. Connell and Morin were not Jaime's grandparents. They weren't even a couple. They were con artists, possibly killers. The house I'd visited belonged to a terrified woman they'd threatened into giving it up temporarily. Police found £10,000 in a shoebox, untouched. Hush money. They'd used me, used my skills to find Jaime. And once I did, they made their move. The case went cold. No prints, no trace. The house had been sterilized. The victims' families, especially the other man's, paid for injunctions to keep it out of the press. Wealth and shame go hand in hand, I suppose. And Jaime's death, a few lines in the paper, no follow-up, no justice. That case haunts me. I've solved dozens more since, but none like Jaime. They say every investigator has a case that sticks, that one you never forget. Jaime was mine, and I'll carry him with me until the end. The photographer in apartment 9B. My name is Russell, and I work as a private investigator in Manchester. I've been doing this job for over 10 years now, and while I've seen my fair share of liars, cheaters, and criminals, there are still cases that crawl under your skin and refuse to leave. This one started like any other, simple, routine, forgettable, but it turned into something I still lose sleep over. It began when a woman named Julia Rains walked into my office on a rainy Tuesday morning. She was in her early 30s, confident but clearly anxious. She wore a gray trench coat soaked at the sleeves, and her fingernails were bitten down to the skin. I offered her a seat and coffee, but she just shook her head and handed me a file folder. Inside were several photographs, none of them incriminating, but strange. They were shots of Julia herself, taken from different angles, all in public spaces, at the tram station, outside her gym, leaving work. The kind of photos someone might take without permission, without being seen. But they weren't amateur either. The angles were composed, focused, professional. "I think someone's following me," she said, "and I think they're watching me from across the street." She pointed to one of the photos. The background showed a row of apartment windows. She lived in a flat across from an old, red brick building in Castlefield. The windows in the image had a particular tint, greenish like old film glass. Julia believed the photographer lived in apartment 9B of that building. "I've seen movement," she said. "Shadows, camera flashes at night, but every time I look directly, the lights go out." I asked if she'd reported it to the police. She had. They took her statement but found no evidence of wrongdoing. The man in 9B, according to the officer who visited, claimed he was a professional still-life photographer and rarely even left the apartment. No signs of harassment, no direct threat. Case closed. That's where I came in. That afternoon, I drove to Castlefield and parked across from Julia's building. The street was narrow, cobbled, with trees lining one side. Apartment 9B was on the 3rd floor, one window slightly open. I couldn't see anyone, but I had the feeling I was being watched. Not just watched, evaluated. I started a 2-week surveillance. I watched 9B from a rented flat across the street, keeping a journal of every movement. The occupant, a man in his mid-40s named Edwin Moore, lived alone. He rarely left the building. Once or twice a week, a courier would deliver small packages. I watched him through long-lens photographs. He had an unsettling stillness about him, almost robotic. No expressions, no routine beyond pacing and occasionally adjusting large studio lights in his room. What chilled me most was the way he interacted with the window. He'd open it just slightly at dusk, not enough to lean out, not enough for fresh air, just enough to let the glass reflect. And on 3 separate nights, I saw the faintest glimmer of a flash from behind those curtains. On the 10th day, I decided to speak with him. Under the pretense of being a photography enthusiast, I rang his buzzer and asked if I could see his work. To my surprise, he buzzed me in. His apartment was cold and dimly lit, filled with old photography gear, tripods, lenses, light boxes. The walls were covered in thick blackout curtains, and the air smelled like chemicals and mildew. Edwin was polite but distant. He wore thick glasses and a photographer's vest full of little pockets. He offered me tea, which I declined, and led me to a makeshift gallery room in the back. What I saw there still haunts me. Rows of mounted photographs, all meticulously labeled by date and location. At first they were mundane: fruit bowls, cityscapes, empty streets. Then came the portraits. Dozens of women, all photographed without their knowledge. Some from across streets, others through windows, gym mirrors, bus stops. And then, Julia. Multiple shots, different outfits, different times of day. Some were taken at such close proximity, I couldn't believe she hadn't noticed. One image showed her unlocking her flat door. Another showed her in bed, visible through a barely cracked curtain. My hands trembled as I asked him if the women knew they were being photographed. He tilted his head and smiled. "Number, that's the point. I capture them before they ruin the moment with performance." I tried to keep calm, to keep him talking. "You're not worried they'd be upset?" "They're art," he said flatly. "They don't know they're part of something beautiful." I thanked him, left the apartment, and called Julia. She was furious and frightened. She wanted to press charges. But I had to break it to her gently. What he'd done, while invasive, technically wasn't illegal under current UK laws. He'd never entered her property, never threatened her, never made contact. I told her we could go public, try a restraining order, or expose him online. She agreed to give me a few more days to dig deeper. That was my mistake. The next evening, I was reviewing surveillance footage in my flat when I saw something strange. At 2:14 a.m., Julia's front light flickered, then shut off. 2 minutes later, the camera on her hallway lost feed. I grabbed my coat, ran across the street, and sprinted up the stairs. Her door was ajar. Inside, the flat was dark, completely dark. I called out her name, no answer. I moved through the rooms carefully, heart racing, flashlight in hand. The living room was in disarray, cushions tossed, drawers pulled open. In the bedroom, the bedsheets were bunched as if someone had been dragged. On the dresser was a single photograph, a freshly printed image of Julia, tied up, eyes wide in terror. It hadn't been taken in that apartment. The background was concrete, rust-stained, industrial, possibly a basement. She was gone. I drove straight to Edwin Moore's building, but by the time I arrived, the flat was empty. No sign of him. The curtains were gone, the photographs cleared from the walls, like he'd never been there. Police launched a full investigation, finally taking the matter seriously. I handed over every photo I'd copied, all my surveillance, and the photograph of Julia in the basement. They tracked his phone to a signal that went dead on the M62 near Huddersfield. From there, nothing. They searched the countryside, abandoned factories, disused military bunkers. No trace. 2 weeks passed. Then a break came in the form of a delivery address. One of Edwin's parcels had been signed for under a different name at an industrial storage site just outside Oldham. When police raided it, they found the remains of a photography studio inside, and they found Julia, alive. She'd been drugged, bound, and kept in a dark room for over 15 days. He hadn't harmed her physically beyond restraint, but the psychological trauma was immense. She'd been posed, photographed, and forced to stare at his collection of images like they were a gallery exhibit. He called her Muse number 63. Edwin Moore was never caught. Authorities believe he changed identities and disappeared across the border. His past was a mystery. No birth record, no family, no digital trail. It was as if he'd existed solely through the lens of his camera. Julia moved away, changed her name, and started therapy. I visited her once after she recovered, and she thanked me with a hug that lingered just a second too long. We don't talk anymore. She said she couldn't look at me without remembering that apartment, that photo, and the day her world collapsed. I don't blame her. Not all monsters use weapons. Some hide behind art, behind lenses, behind laws that haven't caught up to the dangers of obsession. What I learned from that case was simple, but chilling. Sometimes you're not being watched by a stalker. You're being studied. And that thought, that someone could see you, capture you, frame you, without ever touching you, still keeps me up at night.